Okay, so let's analyze the functions of the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a protective layer around your central nervous system. This blood-brain barrier sits right underneath your skull, and it's actually made up of three layers that are called the meninges. And these three meninges protect your brain both from physical as well as from chemical damage. If you look here in the diagram, you can see the skin of the scalp at the very outer, right, on the lateral part of the brain here, so it's out on the outside. Then, if you move towards the medial center, right, if you move inwards into the brain, you've got your skull. Then right underneath that is your dura mater, which is your first layer of your meninges, your arachnoid membrane right underneath that, and lastly is your pia mater, which is here in purple. Okay. Now, fluids, you can also see within these three layers, there is an artery. There are also blood vessels that travel through something called the subarachnoid space. This is the space between the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater. Your brain maintains a very specific chemical environment, and so it does not allow lots of substances to cross into your brain. For example, if you consume tryptophan in Turkey at Thanksgiving, tryptophan, we often say, makes you sleepy. In fact, actually, tryptophan cannot penetrate your blood-brain barrier, so it has to be converted in your blood into another kind of amino acid that can then, to an amino acid product that can then be passed across your blood-brain barrier through these blood vessels. It then goes into the subarachnoid space, across the pia mater, and into the brain. Okay, so your brain has these protective layers. Now, the dura mater, the outer layer that's here in blue, the dura mater is a thick, leathery layer. If you felt it, it would feel like it was actually thick leather. It means hard mother, so dura just means hard, and mater means mother. So the dura mater provides protection from physical damage. Right underneath that is the arachnoid membrane. This arachnoid membrane is your thinnest layer and is impermeable to fluid. So liquids that you consume cannot actually pass through the arachnoid membrane, the arachnoid layer, nor can fluids that are inside your brain pass out of it, except across the arteries, which you can see here as they penetrate deep into the brain. The last layer is the pia mater, which just means pious mother. And the pia mater is a transparent, thin layer that allows all of your capillaries and your blood vessels to exchange nutrients from the brain. Remember, your arachnoid membrane is impermeable to fluid, so there is no way for blood to get into your brain. And in fact, when blood does get into your brain, it usually results in some sort of physical trauma or damage. For example, if your immune system was able to access your central nervous system, right, your antibodies, it actually would start attacking some of your own brain cells because it doesn't recognize them as being part of you. This condition is actually multiple sclerosis. It's when your own immune system starts attacking your central nervous system, triggering the symptoms of MS. So this blood-brain barrier serves an important function to keep you safe. But unfortunately, sometimes infections do get into the blood-brain barrier, and the swelling that's caused can cause a disorder called meningitis. Now, there are lots of different kinds of meningitis. It can be caused by a bacterial infection, or it can be caused by a viral infection. The meningitis happens when the arachnoid layer becomes inflamed. So you can see here in this image of somebody with meningitis how swollen. You can see the blood vessels are really heavily inflamed. That swelling actually starts to push on the brain and cause severe damage, seizures, and eventually death. So we try to treat meningitis very quickly with antibiotics, potentially with antiviral agents, and also with anti-inflammatory drugs to try to remove some of the inflammation. The other thing that happens within your central nervous system, I said, is a part of your protective layer is a part of your protective system is not a layer like your meninges, but is your cerebral spinal fluid, or what we call CSF. Your cerebral spinal fluid surrounds the outside part of your brain, and it also is secreted from inside structures called ventricles that are deep inside your brain. So think of your brain as floating in this vat of cerebral spinal fluid that almost works like a protective layer that cushions your brain. So it's like being surrounded by liquid pillows, right? So that if anything happens to your brain, if you get in a car accident and your brain moves forward in your skull, normally that would cause physical damage because your brain would hit the front of your skull, it would bounce off and then go to the back of your skull and cause more damage. Your cerebral spinal fluid, though, minimizes some of that movement. It serves as a cushion, okay? The way you produce cerebral spinal fluid is from your choroid plexus. Your choroid plexus sits deep inside your ventricles. You actually have 4 ventricles total. You have 2 lateral ventricles, which are your first and second ventricles, a third ventricle, which is right in the medial part of the brain, and then lastly, you have a 4th ventricle, which goes down the the caudal part of your brain down into the top of your spinal cord, okay? And that eventually becomes what we call a central canal, which carries spinal fluid all the way down to the base of your spine. So spinal fluid is being made up at the top of your ventricles, and it's passing down, it's sort of bathing your brain in fluid, then it travels down to the base of your spinal cord. This not only provides physical protection, but it also transmits blood plasma, which contains all the nutrients that you need from your capillaries to various parts of your brain. But it is possible to have a condition called hydrocephalus. You may have heard of this. We used to call it water on the brain. Hydrocephalus happens when you have some sort of blockage in your CSF drainage, and where the blockage happens explains the kinds of symptoms that you tend to experience. So here's a picture of a baby that has hydrocephalus. You can see with light behind the skull how swollen the skull is, right? Babies' brain skull plates have not fused yet, so they're very movable. So you can sometimes see the physical changes much more easily in a baby than you can in an adult whose skull has fused and is no longer mobile. So cerebral spinal fluid would normally travel up from the ventricles, down across the outside of your brain, down through the central canal, and would exit at the very base. But in fact, if you have hydrocephalus, you have a blockage somewhere along here. Usually they tend to be most commonly here in the cerebral aqueduct or in the central canal. To relieve that pressure, we usually have to place a shunt. The shunt actually goes around the blockage because we usually can't get into that area of the brain to move the blockage. And we put a shunt that then drains spinal fluid, usually from the top of your skull, and it drains it down to the base of your neck and down to the base of your spinal cord.